welcome or welcome back to my channel. Writing a book series is a really exciting idea. The thought of being able to write several novels about the same characters and experience lots of different journeys and plots and arcs with them and develop this large overarching story is a really fun idea. But when it comes to actually sitting down and plotting a series, and trying to figure out which events go in which book, how do I make sure that each book is good in its own right and the series doesn't drop off, how do I keep it interesting, all of those logistics are kind of difficult to figure out and very overwhelming when you have tons of ideas for this whole series and you have absolutely no idea where to even begin. It's overwhelming. So today I'm going to be giving my top tips and advice and kind of things that I do when it comes to planning a series, just to break it down a little more and make it less overwhelming. My first piece of advice is just a little question that you should ask yourself, and that is, what is the overarching plot of the entire series? Where are we starting and where are we ending? What are the themes? What are some events that might happen? Don't worry about figuring it out or organizing it yet. Just figure out what is the plot so that when it comes to splitting into different books, plotting those books, you know what you're trying to execute. What is the general overarching plot that book one will work towards but not quite get there, and then book two we need to keep working towards the end goal, and then book three we need to keep what is that? What is the plot? What is the thing that's going to tie all the books together? What's the plot? My next piece of advice is to write down every major event that happens in the story, not in each book, in the overarching plot, in the overarching story. What are the major events? This way you can see what points you want to hit in the story so that you don't leave anything out, and also you can spread out each event throughout the books. I also use this step with the writing down of the major events. I use this to kind of decide how many books they're gonna be. In my mind, there should be at least one major event in each book, obviously, depending on how crazy the event is. Probably more two major events, a kind of inciting incident type, then kind of a plot twist or a turning point kind of event. I'm gonna use Hunger Games as an example. I have not read the books, so I can't use the books as an example, but I'm gonna use the plot from the movies just as a plot example. In the first movie, the kind of inciting incident event is them getting reaped into the Hunger Games, and then the whole middle plot is them in the Hunger Games, and then the final turning point of the story is when they win the Hunger Games. And then in the second movie, the kind of inciting incident is when and then in the second movie, the kind of inciting incident is when they get the news that they have to go back into the Hunger Games, and then the end turning point plot twist kind of event is when Katniss destroys the dome. Think one or two major points in each story. Each book should be progressing towards the end goal, but there should be some sort of plot twist or setback at the end of each, kind of a cliffhanger, or just as the reader you're where is this gonna go next? But you, as the author, have the plan of how it's all gonna go. By kind of writing down the main events, you can figure out how each book is going to go and spread out the story and have good pacing. Along those same lines of writing down the entire story, start to finish, is to outline the entire story before splitting into books. So write down the major events that you want to happen from beginning to end, and then outline the entire story as if it was one continuous story, because it should be, and then split into books. This way the story just flows better and is all just the continuous story. Kind of mentioned this before, but just to rehash, my next little point that I have is each book should be connected in a continuous story, obviously, but a different complete story arc in of itself. Like I mentioned before, there should be kind of like an inciting incident, a whole plot, and then kind of like a turning point, maybe plot twist, maybe cliffhanger, depending on the book, depending on where you are at in the story. And then the next book should have an inciting incident, a whole story arc, and then a turning point, inciting incident, cliffhanger, next book. Each book should be a complete story in of itself. My next tip is, once you have the entirety of the story split into the different books, roughly, make a very detailed outline for each book before you even start writing the first one. Make sure that pretty much the entire series is planned out before you start. This just helps you as the author writing the first one, knowing where you're gonna end up, and also this is kind of just a fun part. This helps you be able to foreshadow and sprinkle in little details that are gonna happen in the last book. You can kind of foreshadow in the first book, and that's just like a fun little author thing. And planning the entire series before you start can help. This doesn't have to be like you write an entire zero draft for each book before you even really start the first one, but just do an outline of all of the events, all of the stuff that happens from start to finish, just to make sure you have a very clear image in your mind of where it's gonna go. My next tip is to plan character arcs and character relationships for each book. I'm gonna assume that there's multiple characters in your book, so just make sure that in each book they're going through a different arc, a different internal storyline. Also, if you have characters that are interacting with each other, make sure that their relationships shift and change and grow throughout the series. This makes your characters feel more human because obviously the things that are happening would affect them and change them. And also, it just makes the story more interesting as the reader to have your characters growing and changing, either in a good way or a bad way. You can decide. Something that you can do if you want to make this easier while you're planning like the entire story arc before, back before we've split it up and all that, just the entire arc. You can also write down an entire arc of your character throughout the entirety of the story from the beginning to the end. In each book, you kind of know where they're at. But I feel like for the most part, if you're writing like a fantasy or a dystopian or something, your characters will usually just change with the world around them, either like getting angry about what's happening around them, becoming more brave, maybe shrinking into themselves. I feel like most of the time in a fantasy or dystopian, it's reactive. But if you wanted to plan an entire character arc, you should do that. I think that you should definitely have your character end up at the very end of the series, like in a completely different place. My next tip, which I have also briefly brought up before, is to make sure that each book at the end has a cliffhanger or some loose ends, just some unanswered questions that can lead into the second book. This just kind of keeps readers reading because they want to know what happens, and it also helps you because it just automatically, if you leave loose ends, if you end on a cliffhanger, you're gonna have to, that just kind of automatically gives you some things that need to happen in the second book, so that helps you plotting wise. My last and final tip is to keep a document, a notebook, whatever, just keep track of all of the loose ends, all of the character arcs, all of the plots. Just make sure that you keep track of everything to make sure that every question gets answered, make sure that every character gets some sort of arc, some sort of transformation, make sure that you hit every plot point. I feel like when you write a series, you really have to be like on top of everything to make sure that it's all going according to plan, to make sure that everything's happening as it should, just to avoid any plot holes, any unanswered questions. Keep really good track of everything. This was kind of more of like a rambly video, because writing a series is not really something that I can like sit down and tell you how to do. Like, writing is very personal, do whatever process works for you. But those were just some of my tips and kind of things that I do to make the whole process of it a little simpler and less overwhelming. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please like the video if you did. Comment your thoughts on the video. Comment, you know, questions or your own advice. Also, let me know if there's any videos you want to see from me. You can also subscribe. I post bookish content, writing tips and advice, writing vlogs, reading wrap-ups, book recommendations, all things books. I like to talk about it, so if that is up your alley, you should subscribe. I post once a week, sometimes twice. Yeah, with all that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a really great day. Bye!